What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the Crew 2, and in this video I did want to do a comparison versus the KTM X-Bow R and the Red Bull RB14. This car did actually receive the handling update recently, and my goodness, it's going to be an absolute monster. But one thing I do want to mention though, I really don't think the KTM X-Bow R is going to be bad in any way now. Like, I was using this car recently, and I'm honestly still pretty dang surprised with it. Like, this thing definitely handles nicely. There is going to be a few things I did notice about the X-Bow R though that I do want to go over in this video, because I do feel like it might have some flaws to it when it comes to how it handles, at least compared to the new handling model of the lovely RB14. For me personally, guys, I would say you could probably still get a really good score using the X-Bow R, but I also really do feel like the RB14 is going to be a really good vehicle now as well. Like, this thing's going to be insanely improved, especially the way this thing actually drove before. I feel like a lot of players probably didn't run the RB14 or the 13 for that matter in pretty much anything. I also do feel like that's going to be for good measures as well before, because these cars were honestly not that impressive. Sure, they might have the highest top speed, but if that's all these things have going for them when you're trying to race around a track, I feel like they're not going to be used. So seeing Ubisoft actually update the handling model on the RB14 is probably going to give many players hope that the other Alpha GP cars are also going to get this. I feel like if we start seeing other vehicles in this class start getting improved, I feel like a lot of players are going to get excited for the other classes in the game, which I do feel like some of those also need a rework. I also have no idea why those tires are on that thing, but for example, guys, the Mark X is going to still be a great car, but again, I really do feel like the RB14 is going to be so much better, and I feel like the Disruption Edition is also going to benefit heavily from this update as well, similar to the Alpha Mark II, which I also feel like is one of those cars you just don't see used all that much now. So I feel like having a handling update on all of these is probably going to be absolutely insane. But one thing I do want to point out though, guys, the KTM X-Bow R Spear Racing ED is still going to remain one of the best Alpha GP cars in the game. One of the only issues with the Spear Racing ED though is the fact that many players probably don't actually have this car because it wasn't a motor pass a while back. So who knows, maybe Ubisoft might add this thing back into the game similar to like the Bugatti Chiron and or the Stingray interception unit. So who knows, guys? This car can definitely return to the game in the future, so I'm sure a lot of players are probably hoping for that. And then obviously moving over to the X-Bow R, I really don't think this car is going to be bad in any way, as I did mention before. Sure, this thing might be a little bit different with the way it handles compared to like the RB14, which one thing I do want to mention, by the way, I read something that apparently the RB14 got the similar handling model of the X-Bow R, which I can definitely see that, especially in the agility of the RB14. So I really do feel like that's a great way to actually start with many of the vehicles, but I also feel like one of the biggest issues many players might have with some of these Alpha GP vehicles is the way that these things actually handle and or their stability as well. So I'm sure a lot of players did notice the overall stability of these vehicles might not be the greatest and or sometimes can be insanely annoying to use. Like, I think that was one of the biggest flaws of the X-Bow R, which I will jump more into that here in a second, guys. But I feel like the biggest issue is going to be the way the car has like twitchiness to it. I feel like it's going to take some of your confidence away when going around corners and actually trying to get the most speed out of that vehicle, for example. So it's definitely going to be a bit of a learning curve to get used to some of the way these Alpha GP cars handle. But I really do feel like, guys, the RB14 and the X-Bow R are probably going to be the best ones you can use at the moment. And if you guys do have the Spear Racing ED, I would recommend trying that thing out if you haven't. This car is definitely going to be pretty incredible. But nonetheless, though, the first thing I did want to go over is going to be the top speed of both of these Alpha GP cars, which is actually going to be pretty different. So starting off here with the KTM X-Bow R, this thing's going to do around 275 to like 277 miles per hour, which is still going to be plenty fast for basically any of the tracks in the game. Then we're going to have the RB14, which is going to do 297 to like 298 miles per hour or so. And by the way, guys, running Nitro Chemist on these cars is going to get up to speed insanely quick, so I do feel like having a higher top speed is going to be insanely helpful. But also, if you guys are doing track racing and stuff, I feel like that extra 20 miles per hour might help just a little bit on some of the straightaways and some of the races, but I don't think it's going to really affect the KTM. And after testing out the X-Bow R once again, I also really do feel like the lower top speed's probably not going to hurt this car all that much. Unless you guys wanted to do some of the US Speed Tour races, then sure, that extra 20 miles per hour that the RB14 has is still probably going to be a lot better in that aspect. But on the tracks though, I really do feel like the KTM's still going to be a very good car. So this is the first car I did want to talk about. I'm sure a lot of players are probably wondering, is the RB14 going to be like the new best meta type of vehicle in the Alpha GP class? And I feel like from the testing I have done, guys, I really don't think the KTM's going to fall off all that much. I mean, I actually jumped into a race with it and managed to beat my old time that I used with it, which I wasn't really expecting to do that. And not only that though, I also did have to adjust the car just a little bit. So I will show the settings for both of these Alpha GP cars at the end of this video as well if you guys do want to check that out. But there's a few things about the KTM that I did notice, especially compared to the RB14. I feel like a lot of players are going to notice. So one of the biggest things I'd say with the Alpha GP cars, and this could probably go for some of the other cars in the Crew 2 as well, but I feel like some of them really do have like bad stability and or like some twitchiness to them. And this is one of the biggest things I have noticed about the KTM X-Bow R. Now, I'm not saying, guys, this car is going to be bad in any way, but I do feel like the way this thing does have its stability set up, and sure, this thing's going to have like more agility and stuff like that because it's going to be a smaller F1 car. I really do feel like the way this thing does corner sometimes is probably going to annoy people. I did see some old comments about this as well with the KTM X-Bow R, basically saying it's like kind of unstable and or it just doesn't feel that great compared to some of the other Alpha GP cars. I also had some people running the Mark X over that car because they did think it was better. What's also kind of funny is I do feel like the Spear Racing ED does handle better than the regular X-Bow R, which is kind of funny, but also, guys, again, that car is not available at the moment, so you basically have to run the regular X-Bow R if you do want to try this thing out. And I'm sure many players have noticed in most of the summits recently with any type of Alpha GP race that's no restriction, or even some of these slaloms and or some of the escapes as well, you're probably only going to see the X-Bow R, but I really do feel like that's going to change now with the RB14 being so much better. I really do feel like all the Alpha GP cars should be on this handling model and or at least updated so players can try them out and they might actually be usable compared to some of the others, because there's definitely a lot of cars in the Crew 2 that basically just fall into like a pit and you probably don't feel like running them anymore. And I really do feel like that happens pretty often. But I'm also going to say, guys, I really don't think the X-Bow R is going to fall into this pit though, because this car is still going to be insanely good. When I was racing this thing around the track, I honestly was like, wow, this thing still is really good even with the RB14 being much better. I really do feel like the X-Bow is still going to be a really viable option on basically everything. And it might even go as far as saying a lot of players might not actually pick the RB14 over the KTM X-Bow R, and that could honestly be for good reasoning, because maybe you guys might like how the KTM is, or maybe you like the way that car looks over like the RB or something like that. So it really does come down to preference though, but I really do feel like the KTM is still going to be a great car. I mean, even jumping into a couple of races with it, I'm still insanely impressed, and I would even run this car more in the future as well on many of the races because it's still going to be really good. But it could even come down to the fact of wanting to use different cars and or try something else out. But when it comes to like a summit or something, you are only seeing like the KTM, but now I really do feel like the RB is also going to be used, so it's definitely going to mix up the gameplay, which I really do think many players are most likely looking for, guys. But to sum up the KTM X-Bow R, I would say this thing is still going to be a really good option on basically everything. Sure, it might feel a little bit more twitchy and or maybe unstable at certain areas, but I really don't think that's going to hurt this car in any way. And again, I also don't think that lower top speed will affect this vehicle in a negative way at all. It's most likely going to come down to the way this car actually handles, which I really do still think is going to put it on top. Even with a lower top speed, I really don't think that's going to affect in any way if you guys did want to run this thing in a summit. Now, if you did actually want to do like a US Speed Tour event, then sure, that lower top speed might hurt because the RB14 is obviously going to pull away on those races because it does like 22 miles per hour faster, which in return can definitely help a lot with your time on a race, especially in a summit. Even then though, I feel like on many of the tracks, the KTM X-Bow R is still going to be an absolute monster. And now moving right over to the RB14, I would probably say many players are most likely feeling the same way I am. Like, my goodness, this thing is absolutely ridiculous, guys. Like, I really do love the way the Red Bull actually feels when you're racing it. The way this thing grips, the way it actually feels going around a corner, it really does inspire so much confidence in like any player for that matter. So I would definitely recommend trying out the RB14. Now, I'm not trying to like clown on the KTM X-Bow or anything like that, but the RB14 really does feel so much better than what it used to, especially racing this thing around a track. Like, that stability, my goodness, is going to be unmatched. And I might even go as far as saying I feel like the RB14 is like a better version of the KTM X-Bow R. Now, the main reason why I'm going to say that, guys, is I feel like the RB14 doesn't have the stability and or like the twitchiness issue that the regular KTM is going to have, which is not really that big of a deal, but I also feel like having more stable handling and stuff like that is going to make a big difference. What's very interesting about this is from jumping car to car, you guys will actually probably see like a difference in the way they might handle and or like the response from your controller, which is kind of interesting. I can't speak for the people using a wheel because I'm not using a wheel at the moment, but I also do feel like if you guys are running this on your controller, I also feel like many of the cars are going to feel different than each other, and that can also be a good thing, but also a bad thing as well. Like, for example, guys, jumping into like the Huracan Performante, you're going to be like, dang, this thing's very stable, but then if you jump into like a Bugatti Chiron, or even like the Devo, you're going to be like, where's my stability at higher speeds? So you will definitely see like the difference between the vehicles in that aspect. I also feel like that's going to be the same thing with the Alpha GP cars as well, because like using the RB14, then like jumping into something like the Mark X, I'm like, my goodness, this car just feels so much better around corners. Not only that, it also is going to feel faster as well, which is definitely going to be a plus. So having something that's insanely fast, but it can also handle really well, is going to be an absolute monster in any class. And I feel like that's going to be a really good thing though, because the KTM's probably been owning this class for a very long time, and I feel like many players might end up getting annoyed seeing like an Alpha GP race or something in like a summit, and maybe they're not a huge fan of the KTM. They're like, oh man, now I have to use this car, but luckily, guys, that's not going to be the case anymore because we have the RB14 right now that this thing literally sticks to the ground around corners. And if you guys are running manual, I notice like fourth and fifth gear is going to be your best friend on this one. Like, this thing will accelerate out of a corner right into sixth gear, and it's honestly incredible the way it can do it. So I will definitely have to look into trying out more of the Alpha GP cars versus the RB14, just to see how much better the RB14 might be in some areas, and maybe we can find some of the main flaws with the other Alpha GP cars. And I feel like when they update one of the vehicles like this, they're probably trying to see how the players will react to it, to see if they're going to do it to the other cars in the class. Like, for example, guys, we obviously do have a lot of those vehicles in the touring class being updated, which, my goodness, every vehicle that I've tried out so far is going to be so much better and maybe run something different. What's kind of funny about that as well is the fact that every time like a race showed up in a summit, I was like, oh man, I have to use the KTM once again. Like, I don't have anything against that car, guys. I really do want to try out other vehicles in these classes, but unfortunately in some way, some of the cars are obviously going to be significantly worse than the others. So if you are trying to compete in like a summit, that car is obviously not going to do that great. So seeing other vehicles get the same update, I really do think is going to be very important, and also greatly mix up each class as well, so many players can try out different cars and actually have fun with them. And now that the RB14 was actually updated, we will now have a direct competitor versus the KTM X-Bow R, which I feel like this is going to make a lot of players happy because now they can run something different. From the testing I have done, I would actually admit that I do think the RB14 for me is at least going to be a lot better than the KTM. I don't know why, guys, but I just like the way this car handles now compared to that. Like, it doesn't have any twitchiness and or like unstableness to it. Like, this thing's going to be insanely solid. Not only that, though, if you guys get a good build on this vehicle, you can not only run this thing on tracks and stuff, you can also jump onto like the US Speed Tour events, and this car is going to be plenty fast. And what's also surprising is the fact that the RB14 does handle really nicely on the road as well, which I was noticing the Alpha GP cars are kind of weird on the road at times. even the KTM X-Bow R just doesn't feel right, which I do think is going to be a bit of an issue, but also a really big positive for the RB14 when it comes to going against the KTM. Not only that, guys, this thing's going to be easily used on slaloms and or escapes as well. For one, it does 298 miles an hour compared to the 277 or so. And if you guys are doing an escape, I would definitely say the RB14 is going to be the car you will want to use for that. At least compared to something like the KTM X-Bow R, because I really do feel like this car is going to end up stomping that thing in every way when it comes to like an escape because of that speed. Also, the handling and stability on the road I really do feel like is going to be way better than what it was. Not only is the RB14 going to be insanely good on the road, but you guys can then jump onto a track and still get an insanely good score with it. Like, the handling is going to be that amazing on this car, and I would even go as far as saying you could probably beat the KTM X-Bow on the track with this vehicle as well. Like, I do think it's that much better. Which, if I had to guess, I would say a lot of players are probably going to agree with this, because now that we have another car we can actually use in the Alpha GP class, we don't always have to run toward like the KTM or something. So if you guys wanted to mix it up, you can now jump right into the RB14 and still easily compete in the summits and get a really high score in those races. So this is definitely going to be a plus, and at least we're seeing a lot of the old cars on the Crew 2 actually get some love now, and maybe that will make them a lot more usable, but also mix up like the metas in each class as well, which, if I had to guess, guys, I would say many players are probably going to be wanting this as well, and seeing some of these older cars actually pop up now is definitely going to be a nice sight to see. So overall, I would say you really can't go wrong with either one of these cars. Like, they're both going to be really good options on basically everything. I would also say both KTMs and the RB14 are probably still going to remain on top of the best vehicles in the Alpha GP class, and having the RB14 now being updated, guys, makes me insanely excited, because I really do love the way this car handles, and for me personally, I will most likely be picking the RB14 over the KTM. I just really like the way this car handles and or the way it feels a lot more than the KTM. I've just been enjoying this RB14 so much that it's probably going to be hard for me to go back to the KTM, but I would say, guys, either way, you really can't go wrong with any one of these cars. But which car do you guys actually like to use more? And I feel like a lot of players most likely will turn to the RB14 for now, because I really do feel like this car is heavily going to disrupt the Alpha GP class in probably a positive way. I also can't wait to see how the other vehicles are going to do with this handling update, because I really do think doing this to the vehicles is definitely moving in the right direction. But here are the settings I'm also running on both of these cars as well, guys, and thank you all so much for watching.